You are listening to From Embers, a weekly show on CFRC 101.9 FM about anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas and practice. We are broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on land that has come to be called Kingston, Ontario, Canada, because of the thievery and brutality of the Canadian state and its empire-loving parents. From Embers is about fires, some real and some metaphorical. Fires started generations ago and tended to over the years. Little sparks all across this territory that we hope will grow, spread, and engulf the thieving state called Canada and the capitalist system that has plagued this land since the fur trade.
Every year on August 10th, both inside and outside of jails and prisons across Canada, prisoners and their supporters mark Prisoners' Justice Day. Prisoners' Justice Day emerged in the 1970s amidst a national restructuring and expansion of the prison system, and waves of social unrest both inside and outside of Canada's prisons. Following the Kingston Penitentiary Uprising of 1971, the largest and most destructive prison riot in Canadian history, most of the prisoners were transferred to Millhaven Institution, which was still under construction. Retribution from the guards followed, as documented by a Justice Committee report to the federal government, which read, "Millhaven early history was marked by the use of clubs, shackles, tear gas, and dogs, often in combination. Dogs were let loose on prisoners in the yard and in their cells. Gas was used to punish prisoners frequently. In March 1973, as often as 3 or 4 times a week. Prisoners who were first shackled, sometimes hands and feet together, were then beaten with clubs, made to crawl on the floor, and finally gassed." End quote. On August 10th, 1974, Eddie Nayland bled to death in Millhaven's segregation unit after cutting himself with a razor blade, following a lengthy dispute with the institution over a transfer. The investigation into his death revealed that the guards had disconnected his emergency signaling system. On the first anniversary of his death, prisoners refused work and food to mark Nayland's death and to show solidarity with an ongoing strike at British Columbia Penitentiary, a strike that would eventually spread to both Collins Bay and Joyceville institutions in Ontario. On May 21st, 1976, Bobby Landers also died in Millhaven's segregation unit. Landers was a respected prisoner organizer who had been punitively transferred and thrown in the hole for organizing a work stoppage at Archambault in Quebec. On the night he died, he repeatedly requested medical attention, but again, the panic button had been disconnected and the nurse on duty could be heard laughing and talking with the guards down the hall. The next morning, he was found dead from a heart attack, clutching a note requesting medical attention. In response to Landers' death, prisoners at Millhaven Institution called for a work and hunger strike on August 10th and circulated it across the country, which was widely adopted. Since then, Prisoners' Justice Day has become an annual tradition of remembrance, a display of collective strength through the refusal of work and food, and an opportunity to bring attention to the ongoing struggles being waged inside by prisoners for better conditions and capacities. On this episode of From Embers, I spoke with Veronica, an anarchist in Montreal who's part of organizing the annual New Year's Eve noise demos in Laval. We discussed the history of Prisoners' Justice Day, what has changed since the 1970s, how Prisoners' Justice Day will be marked and articulated this year, recuperation by liberal governments, anarchist approaches to prisoner solidarity, and how to get started. Between doing this interview and releasing this episode, I also attended a documentary screening and panel discussion with several women who were incarcerated in the prison for women in Kingston before it closed in the year 2000. It was organized by a collective in town that is telling stories about the women who lived and died at this prison, carrying their memories forward and pushing to have a memorial garden established on the grounds of the now vacant prison. I was struck by how raw and powerful these stories are, both for the women sharing them and for those of us who were just there to listen. It got me thinking about how difficult it is to convey the emotional weight of these stories in a podcast form. And so I wanted to encourage everyone, if you get the chance, to attend a Prisoners' Justice Day event in your area this year or next. Here in Kingston, there will be visits to the grave sites of the Landers brothers at St. Mary's Cemetery, a healing circle at the old prison for women, and a special broadcast on CFRC 101.9 FM from 4 to 10 o'clock that will include interviews, a reading of names of the fallen, shout-outs, and song requests for prisoners listening inside one of the many area prisons that get our signal. If you live elsewhere in Canada, check the show notes for this episode, which will include a compiled list of events this year and other resources for learning more. So without further ado, here is our interview with Veronica about Prisoners' Justice Day.
My name is Veronica. I was last on From Embers in December talking about the New Year's Eve noise demo. I'm a part of the crew that organizes the New Year's Eve noise demo every year in Montreal. Because this interview is about Prisoner Justice Day, one of the things I wanted to do to set the tone is to just do a basic honoring all the people I've known who've died inside and all the people I haven't known who've also died inside or on parole. And I wanted to specifically name Peter Collins, who was a longtime activist and inside organizer who died of cancer in 2015, trying to get a medical release, and that the prison system in Ontario wouldn't give him. And then I just wanted to name a few other folks who are getting specifically named at Prisoner Justice Day events around the country this year. There's 3 people in particular who've died in the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center: Cleve, Geddes, Justin St. Amour, and Jean Veillette. And then I just wanted to mention Tom Manning, who's a political prisoner who just died in the U.S. So I just wanted to set the tone and start by kind of naming all of those people. But certainly I'm down to talk about the history of the prisoner rights movement or prisoner movement in the 70s and how that set things up so that we recognize things like Prisoner Justice Day today. It's hard to figure out where to start when talking about history, and I was reading through a book that I would recommend to everyone today in preparation for this interview, which is called Prisons in Canada by Luc Gosselin. It came out with Black Rose Books in the 70s and got translated into English in the 80s. And he kind of talks about a bunch of reforms that happened in the prison system in the 1960s, including things like the living unit system, which kind of changed the role of guards in the prisons and made a lot of them more like parole officers on the inside than guards. And then he also talks about the spread of group therapy as a widespread tactic of control in the 60s especially. And he says that a lot of those changes in the 60s were sparked by a huge riot in 1962 in a prison called St. Vincent de Paul, which is in Laval outside of Montreal. But he also talks about how all of those changes in the 60s led to an end of the liberalization of prisons in the early 70s. And so the 60s had paved the way for that to happen. So the state was using making it look like they were doing progressive steps as a way to win public support for then what became really repressive tactics later. So in the late 60s, you start seeing a huge prison construction boom, and so prisons, they're building more and more prisons across the country, and things are getting more repressive because the budget got expanded so much in the 60s that all of a sudden there's all this extra money to go into the prison system in the 70s. And that explosive prison construction shift is also happening at the same time as the Quebec independence movement is gaining strength, which is an interesting thing to mention just because prisons in Canada have always been connected to nation building and trying to create Canada as a state. So it's interesting that the federal government decides to go on a huge prison building boom while Quebec is starting to push for independence. But yeah, this all kind of sets the tone for what happens in the 70s. And so in 1971, you have a huge riot in Kingston Penitentiary that lasted for 4 days and is one of the biggest riots in the history of Canadian prisons. You have the building of a supermax prison in Laval outside of Montreal. And then you have two high-profile escapes of like 5 or 6 people at a time from that prison in 1972 and 1973. And then in 76, you have this massive strike that starts in Archambault, which is a prison maybe an hour or two outside of Montreal. And there's 350 people who participate in the strike, and the demands are mainly around like protesting the conditions in the prison, but specifically about wanting to have contact visits with family. And people saying, you know, I've been inside for 15 years and I've never been able to touch my kids. Like, I want to be able to give my kid a hug and things like that. So that was their main demand, but they went on strike for 110 days. And that kind of sets the stage for Prisoner Justice Day to get nationalized. So the story of Prisoner Justice Day specifically starts in 1975. There's someone named Eddie Nayland who dies in a segregation cell in Millhaven. And Millhaven is a prison that was opened in the aftermath of the strike in Kingston Penitentiary. Part of the reason the strike happened in Kingston Pen in the first place was because people had heard rumors that Millhaven was going to open and was going to be the supermax and was going to be so much worse than KP. And part of the riot was like people wanting to make a last stand at KP before they all got transferred to Millhaven, which is exactly what happened. Like, a lot of the people involved in the riot in KP got transferred to Millhaven in 71 and were forced to like run a gauntlet to go inside and beaten terribly and attacked with dogs and things like that. And so that's the start of Millhaven. And in 1975, this guy named Eddie Nayland dies in the segregation cell in Millhaven. And a year after his death, which is 1976, a bunch of people in Millhaven decided to commemorate his death with a day where they didn't work and they didn't eat inside. And this is coming in the aftermath of the strike at Archambault, and it becomes a national thing. There's a group called the Odyssey Group that is an inside group that in Millhaven that starts to spread the word that they want, you know, prisoners all across the country to participate in this day to commemorate people who've died inside. And one of the other things that kicks off the National Prisoner Justice Day thing is someone named Robert Landers, who was one of the organizers in Archambault, who gets kicked out of Archambault during the strike and involuntarily transferred to Millhaven, ends up in segregation in Millhaven and dies of a heart attack. And so August 10th that year in 1976 has become this huge thing. And ever since then, lots of people in the federal prison system have recognized it as a day to commemorate people who've died inside and to talk about conditions on the inside that are deplorable and to protest against those conditions. And that started to happen in this context where, you know, there was a lot of movement happening on the outside as well. There were a lot of social movements happening all throughout the 60s and 70s, and prisoners maybe had a bit more support and had, you know, politicized people going in and out of prison. Like in the 70s, you had folks from the FLQ in Quebec ending up in the federal prisons and doing a lot of organizing inside after they get arrested, and a lot of back and forth happening between like radical ideas on the outside and folks getting radicalized on the inside.
Yeah, and you mentioned that there was this sort of push for reform in the 60s that really set the stage for all the unrest in the 70s in terms of small army of kind of social workers, a new kind of class of guard that sort of emerges. And one thing I've heard that was a big factor in this too is that the guards unionized, I think it was in 68 or somewhere in the late 60s, and were able to exert their regressive kind of force as a collective whole in a way that they'd never been able to do before.
Yeah, totally. That was a big part of it too. Definitely the guards unionizing in 68 just set it up so that the guards union had a ton of power in terms of what kinds of reforms got implemented in the prison system in the 70s.
Yeah, and another thing you mentioned that I thought is interesting is the Bobby Landers being involuntarily transferred from Archambault to Millhaven. It seems like at this time, pre-internet, a lot of the communication kind of opportunities that people have today, that a lot of the word was spread through people being involuntarily transferred as punishment for their participation in these uprisings and strikes that were going on.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of the people in the original Odyssey Lifers group in Millhaven were involuntarily transferred across the country, and that is one of the ways that PJD spread across the country is, you know, guys who were pretty solid organizers in Ontario getting shipped out to BC, and then things start going in BC, and, you know, it was just one of these ways. But there were also other ways that people spread things. So there was a woman named Claire Culhane who was very, very involved in prisoner support in that era and up until when she died in 1996. And she was involved in some of the negotiating around some there was a riot in one of the BC pens in the early 70s, and they called in like a citizens advisory committee, and they asked for her to be on the committee, and so she went in and was involved in negotiating the end of that situation. I don't remember exactly if it was like a hostage taking or just a riot, but she was pretty involved in that. Prisoners had a lot of respect for her. She was, personally writing letters to tons and tons of people inside. And so people have also told me that one of the ways PJD spread originally was through Claire Culhane and people like her on the outside, getting information from guys in Ontario and sending that information into places in other provinces and prisons in other places across the country.
Yeah, and she has a great short book called Banned from Prison, I think it's called, that was about her role in that negotiation, which apparently helped prevent a lot of violence that could have happened. And then she was immediately banned from entering any CSC institutions for many years after that.
Yeah, I think it's called Barred from Prison, but yeah, it's really
That's right, Barred from Prison. Yeah. Were you able to get a sense of like how national and how widely Prisoners' Justice Day spread in those few years after 76 in terms of how far across the country did it get? Was it in both the men's and the women's institutions? Was it in jails and prisons?
It was definitely in men's and women's institutions. I mean, at the time, the prison for women in Kingston was the only federal prison for women in the country, and it was definitely happening in P4W, probably as early as 76, although I'm not sure exactly. There's a really good website that I should look up for you so you can put it in the show notes that has old newsletters from inside prison in that era, and there's definitely some newsletters that mention PJD, and it's folks reporting back from different prisons across the country about what high percentage they got to participate. And I think it's like one of the federal men's prisons in Ontario being like, we had 100% participation and things like that. And P4W, I think that year had like 96% participation. That would have been like 77 or 78. So definitely there was like high participation in the women's prison federally, but I haven't ever seen or heard people talking about whether or not PJD was recognized in the provincial prisons. I assume it was because, federal prisons, a lot of people wouldn't have been doing a ton of time. They would maybe do between like 2 and 10 years and then get out and possibly end up in provincial prisons again later. And so I would assume that things spread into the provincial prisons, but I've actually never seen many stories of PJD specifically happening in the provincial prisons. There are definitely stories of some of these like riots and strikes that were happening in the 70s, or people in the provincial prisons going on their own kinds of hunger strikes in solidarity with people in the federal prisons. Certainly during the strike in Archambault that happened, but often during other riots and things like that, things would also happen in the provincial prisons as kind of like a show of solidarity. But in terms of PJD, I'm not sure.
And in terms of outside support for Prisoners' Justice Day in those early years, I know in terms of like from the zine under new management, there's some documentation of people having protests and gatherings outside of prisons during the KP riot and also in Quebec at Archambault. Were you able to dig up anything in terms of what kind of outside support there was for Prisoners' Justice Day besides Claire Culhane?
I've heard stories from people in Montreal that they used to go out to a cemetery for folks who had died in prison that was out in Laval, that was right near, like on the grounds of one of the prisons out there for the longest time. I think it's since been moved to a cemetery like down the road in Laval. But I have heard stories of people going out to this one strip in Laval where most of the prisons are and sort of doing like a vigil/rally kind of thing in the early days of PJD. There was a group in Montreal that was affiliated with the Ligue des Droits, trying to remember what their name was, some sort of like prisoners' rights committee that did a lot of like media work around PJD. People like Jean-Claude Bernheim and Marie Beemans were very involved in publicizing that day as like a thing on the outside, and they were certainly pretty good at getting people to show up at, vigils and rallies to commemorate that kind of stuff, especially in the 80s, but I believe in the 70s as well. But outside of Montreal, I'm not sure. I haven't heard that many stories about things happening. I assume that in Vancouver, things were always happening. Certainly Claire Culhane was out there for a long time, and there are still some really solid organizers in Vancouver who do PJD events every single year, and lots of them have been doing that for decades, so I assume that they were also doing that in the 70s.
And for people who don't know, like what kind of happens inside a federal prison on Prisoners' Justice Day? How is it observed, and is there some variation to that from place to place?
It looks different over time. So I think in the mid 70s when it started, people have told me stories about. So there's what the administration does. So anyone who refuses to eat and refuses to work on Prisoner Justice Day, when it first started, were getting not only like docked a day's pay, but they were getting written up as like a disciplinary charge. And so you would lose a certain number of days of like good behavior standing, like they would knock a few days off your sentence for every day that you had good behavior inside, and you would lose those days, like you wouldn't get those days knocked off your sentence. And so that's kind of what the administration did for the longest time, although that changed over time as well. But in the early days, reading these stories of people in the federal pens being like, we had 100% participation. I know some of how that happened is because like people were threatened with a beating if they didn't participate. Like that was definitely a bit of how you get 100% participation in different jails. It's not like 100% of the people in that prison have the exact same political stance on PJD. But over time, there have been fewer and fewer people participating in Prisoner Justice Day, and I know these days there isn't a huge level of participation in the prisons. Maybe like in the last couple decades, the administration has stopped writing people up as like part of participating. So I wonder if there's lots of different reasons for why that could have happened, but the admin doesn't write people up anymore, and I think there are fewer and fewer people participating in the work strike and in the hunger strike that normally is how people observe Prisoner Justice Day. There also used to be events on the inside. So I think in the 70s and 80s, PJD was a big enough thing. There were enough people on the outside who knew about it that often there would be like memorials and vigils like inside the prisons, and people would be able to come in and participate in those vigils or in those talks. But those don't happen anymore either, as far as I know.
Yeah, just anecdotally speaking, I know in the Kingston area where a lot of the Ontario prisons are, there are still gatherings inside, like with chaplains, but I don't think the public is allowed to attend.
Right.
And it really depends on the kind of political climate of the particular institution, to what extent it's sanctioned and what extent it's censored. Because I know a few years ago, there was a bit of a controversy that the Conservative government tried to capitalize on, where people had printed an image for Prisoners' Justice Day that was an upside-down maple leaf behind bars. Mm-hmm. And the federal government moved to basically ban Prisoners' Justice Day activities and specifically the T-shirts, which has always been a big part of the tradition, as far as I understand it, is people make a T-shirt through an inmate committee or something, and then it gets distributed across the country with the help of the Correctional Service of Canada, and I think they basically stopped that, and people were wearing black armbands instead for a while. So it does seem to kind of ebb and flow with the political climate of the time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's an outside group in Vancouver that actively solicits names of people who've died inside and compiles a really long list of everyone who's died inside that they send around to all the inmates committees and to folks on the outside who are organizing things every year. So certainly that has been a part of the tradition as well.
Also, I know back in the 70s, like there were not inmate committees in the sense that they're a recognized thing today. Are you able to speak a bit about the emergence of sanctioned inmate committees and what effect that could have had on how this is marked?
Yeah, I don't have an exact date, but I do remember reading that inmate committees became federally recognized at some point, probably in the 70s, but possibly in the late 60s. And what that ended up meaning was that instead of prisoners in an institution in a grassroots way coming together, organizing themselves and picking representatives who would then become the inmates committee, the administration took over that process. And so the administration would be like handing out ballots for the votes to pick, the president and the vice president and whoever was on the inmates committee. But then that also meant that the admin would approve or not approve of those selections at the end of the day. So I do think that once the inmates committees were recognized by the federal government, it did mean that they were then more controlled by the government as well, or by the administration in any given prison, because those people do have to be approved these days, at least by Correctional Services Canada, before they can start their serving as the president or the vice president of the committee.
So the warden could veto somebody that was a troublemaker in their eyes or something like that.
Exactly.
How else have you seen the Prisoner's Justice Day change over the years?
So another project that I recently completed is a podcast series called What Happened to Prisoner Justice Day, and it's basically a series of interviews with a bunch of different people trying to answer exactly this question, like what changed. And what people said to me in the context of doing that project were things like changes to how the prison deals with people in protective custody, having a large impact on a sense of paranoia in the prison, and that sense of paranoia making solidarity difficult. So protective custody are people who either the administration has decided need to be in what used to be isolation cells but is no longer the case, or who ask to be put outside of the general population for whatever reason. And often back in those days, it was seen as like, you're in protective custody because you snitched on somebody or because you've done a crime that's generally considered so heinous that if you were in general population, people would probably take it upon themselves to beat you up. And in the 80s, in the men's prisons, especially in the mediums and minimums, the protective custody prisoners started to get integrated into general population. And I think what that sounded like it meant for a lot of people was that there was all of a sudden this sense of paranoia. Like, I don't know if this person was a snitch or not in PC, but I know they were in PC. I'm pretty sure they were PC. So, they might talk about me to the admin or something. And that creating this atmosphere of distrust and paranoia that made it really difficult to do things like PJD in any kind of broad way, because you were never sure if someone actually had your back. There were other things that people brought up would include changes to how long the administration would keep you on the same range. So one of the people I interviewed for that project is Ann Hansen, and she was talking about how when she got thrown back inside on a parole violation in the mid-2000s, they would no longer leave people in the same cell for the entirety of their sentence, which had been her situation in P4W when she was serving her sentence. And so instead what they would do is they would transfer people to a different range almost every 2 weeks, it seemed like, and that made it really difficult for people to build up the kind of relationships that you would need in order to organize inside. And she understood that as like specifically to try and quash that organizing, to try and make it really difficult for people to have any kind of relationship inside where organizing would make any sense. Other things that people have brought up to me are changes to society in general. Like in the 60s and 70s, there were these huge social movements on the outside that fostered a certain sense of solidarity more broadly in society. And in the intervening decades, that sense of solidarity on the outside has declined as well. And so that, of course, has an impact on, the outlook of people who end up in prison and what kind of support people are getting on the outside, which, getting support for things on the outside can be one of the only ways to feel like you won't face certain kinds of repression in prison. I think there's something to be said about the people who seem the most clear on practicing it still are people who either knew some of the folks who were dying in prison in the mid-70s or, were quote-unquote raised by elderly people in prison who knew those people. So there's like this personal connection that, the longer time passes, the less likely it is that people will have that personal connection to someone like Robert Landers or Eddie Nalin. And possibly that is a reason why people don't feel as compelled to recognize Prisoner Justice Day. But yeah, I think those are some of the main things that people brought up. I think a lot of people have said to me that it just feels very individual now. Like you just make your individual choice about whether or not you're going to do it, and that sense of it's a collective thing that we're all doing together is kind of gone.
I mean, that makes sense to me in terms of that point about, the culture in prison being reflected in terms of the culture in society as a whole, if in terms of the erosion of solidarity cultures generally in the world that we live in. Yeah,
for sure.
I guess one of the interesting things to me about Prisoners' Justice Day is how it sort of combines together this like powerful and important ritual of commemoration and remembering people who have died with this display of collective power through the withdrawal of labor and the refusal to eat, and the connection to sort of the political demands of the moment that it emerges in. What kinds of demands are going to be centered this year at Prisoners' Justice Day that you're aware of?
So I went looking for some of the stuff that's happening this year, and one of them stands out as like, this is the demand every year almost, which is an end to solitary confinement. And this year it seems like some people are emphasizing, an end to solitary confinement, even in its new structured intervention unit form, which is referencing the new law that the federal government just passed, which essentially just changes the name of solitary confinement units to structured intervention units, and in many substantial ways doesn't change the process of being held in solitary much at all. And then on the website for the PJD event that's happening in Toronto, there are a few other things, a few of which get named across the board every year, but increasing numbers of women in prison in general in the country as like something to point out on PJD. People talk about wanting to remember that there are a disproportionate number of Indigenous people and people, Black people, African, Caribbean people, sex workers, immigrants, and refugees being held in prison. That call-out also mentions wanting to oppose prison violence and wanting to increase awareness of the actions of many political prisoners that have been criminalized by the government. And then lastly, they talk about raising awareness of the systemic racism and colonialism in correctional institutions and the inadequate health and mental care for all prisoners. And that last one is like a recurring theme too, of like, so many of the people who PJD was started to recognize died because of inadequate health care and inadequate mental health care inside. So that has always been like a big theme around Prisoner Justice Day, and this year seems to be no exception.
I live on the shore of Lake Ontario. The world talks to me through an FM radio. And the gun tower and the guards and the head counts in the yard say it's gonna be a long time before they let me go. Baby, I'm a lifer. I knew as soon as I could walk that I didn't belong. My mother didn't want me and my daddy just went along. And at school it was the same, and the police learned my name. And everything I said, everything I did was wrong. Baby, I'm a lifer. The streets go dark at the end of the business day. When you're on your own, you gotta hide yourself away from the searching city lights and the special interest types who go look for kids who got no place to stay. The fog rolls up on the house of the wasted sons. I dreamed of the day I turned and I fired the gun. I can hear that killing sound and the shadows crowd around. I woke up fast and remembered the thing I'd done. Baby, I'm a lifer. Baby, I'm a lifer.
The track you just heard is called The Lifer, and it's by Christian Collins, who is the brother of the late Pete Collins, a respected prisoner activist and satirical cartoonist who died inside Millhaven Institution back in 2015 after his requests for compassionate release were denied. A collection of Pete's comics was released by Ad Astra Comics last year. It's called Free Inside. You're listening to From Embers, a regular show of anarchist ideas and practice here on CFRC 101.9 FM every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock and podcasting online. This episode is being released on August 10th, 2019, which is Prisoners' Justice Day. And our interview is with Veronica, an anarchist from Montreal involved with the annual New Year's Eve noise demos. Yeah, I'd like to talk a bit about that, the solitary confinement bill too, if you would be willing to, because I know people, it's a very confusing issue because of the way it's been presented by the government as this solution to end solitary confinement. Mm-hmm. But many of the people who were pushing the hardest for this politically within the government, people like Kim Pate, who were prison abolition activists on the outside for decades and have been, she was appointed to the Senate by the Trudeau government and has been sort of carrying on more like a prisoner rights kind of thing from within the Senate. And she's called this out saying this is going to change absolutely nothing. So would you be able to explain what is this structured intervention unit sort of program that's being advanced by the government?
I think one of the main things is that Kim Pate and people like her were pushing for a cap on the number of days you could be held in these units. Like, that was the big thing they really wanted, and in the end, the bill doesn't have that. It doesn't have any kind of cap. And what that does is it leaves it up to the discretion of, whoever the decision-making body is, and maybe there's a new decision-making body and there's some new form of court that has to decide whether or not you can stay in solitary, but the fact that there's no hard cap that would mean that you just have to be let out after a certain period of time seems to be the thing that Kim Pate and people like her were really pissed about. The other thing that people have told me is that because what happened is that the Supreme Court struck down some kind of legislation around solitary confinement that did exist, what was happening was that we were in this weird interim period where actually CSC couldn't put people in solitary of any kind for very long at least. And what the Senate and the House of Commons passing this new bill means is that limbo period is over, and now there are rules on the books about what solitary confinement can look like, and those rules are not very good, but I think also the limbo period was kind of nice for people because it did mean that CSC was having to change what they were doing. They were having to keep people in solitary for less time just because the law that had existed had been struck down.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think about this perspective that I have in terms of the history of corrections and specifically the Liberal Party and how they're basically wizards at taking people's demands and turning them into some kind of system of control that's going to increase their power over people in prison. Mm. And in Kingston, the one that's really present in my mind is this Save the Prison Farms campaign where people mobilized to prevent the closure of a cattle farm that was happening on one of the minimum institutions in Kingston. It was a very sought after job because people got to work with animals and it supplied fresh milk to the prisons. People have campaigned around that for 10 years and now they have announced a return of the program, but it's going to return as a 1,500 goat milking factory that's going to supply an infant formula plant in Kingston and be exported to China for milk powder. So, they're really good at taking, people's campaigns and demands and turning them into some kind of neoliberal, corporate system of control. And nobody wants to work in this goat factory, apparently. They've had very few volunteers even agree to go work there.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds a lot like the trends that Luc Gosselin talks about in his book around, more progressive prison policy being used to win public approval so that, the budget for the prison system can balloon. And then once you have this higher budget, you can bring back all the repressive politics you want and, expand the prison system and make it more difficult for people to get out, things like that. This sounds similar in terms of having some nice rhetoric, do a thing that doesn't actually benefit folks inside.
Yeah, which kind of leads me to my next question, which I think to some people it's an obvious, question that doesn't even have to be asked, but maybe to others it's not. And in terms of for anarchists and the anarchist struggle for freedom, like how does the prisoners movement interact with us, and why is Prisoners' Justice Day important?
For me, anarchism is about fighting for an end to domination, and prisons are certainly a huge part of that. Like, the state uses prisons as a major form of social control, and so fighting that social control and fighting the state in general feels connected to fighting prisons for sure. In terms of why PJD feels important, I have a lot of different reasons. I mean, some of them are very personal, like I've known people who've died inside and I want to be able to honor them. Some of them are more like political, cultural things around like wanting to keep people who've died in those kinds of conditions in our minds as we fight for a better world. And like that idea of anarchism as this ethical imperative, to make the world a better place for, people like Ashley Smith who experienced really horrific things and died inside. And PJD can be a way to do that, to like have a day to set aside to do that and do it collectively in the best case scenario with other people in the world as a way to like build relationships with people and build a culture where, we commemorate these people but also fight so that those kinds of things don't happen to other people. In terms of why the prisoner movement is important to me as an anarchist, I think there's also a piece about knowing that lots of anarchists historically have gone to prison, and that because our struggle is a struggle against the state, it's possible that lots more of us will go to prison in the future. So it feels really useful in certain ways to be acquainted with the prison system and how it works and how resistance works on the inside. I think a lot of people on the outside have this idea that like once you've been thrown in prison, that's it, your life is over. And for so many people who have fought in such beautiful ways inside, that's just so obviously not true. And so staying connected to those kinds of things feels important for that reason as well.
Yeah, certainly in this region, I've noticed like a lot of people myself included, became much more curious about the prison system, at least those of us who weren't already entangled in it because of our families or whatever, after the G20 and after people got even these very short jail sentences, but this kind of need to like figure out how that system works and who's there and making those contacts. A lot of that seemed to happen in like the aftermath of 2010. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense to me too, that would be an era in which people would start to pay more attention to that system and how it works.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a danger like in some of the let's call it the like broad anarchist narrative around prison of creating like a new revolutionary subject out of prisoners?
I used to be more worried that was a thing. I think the problem is maybe broader than that. I think the problem is maybe more that we as anarchists can get really excited about certain kinds of tactics, and certainly in certain situations prisoners have used those tactics. And in some instances of the use of those tactics, it was for very valiant reasons that I really agree with, but not all the time. And maybe that's the danger, is like, just because there's a riot happening somewhere doesn't mean the people who are rioting are doing it for reasons I agree with. And that maybe feels like the more broad danger to me than some kind of like specifically thinking that like prisoners somehow understand and will fight systems of social control more than anybody else in the world.
And, historically, again, in this area that I'm aware of, a lot of the anarchist prison projects have really focused on like the quote unquote political prisoners through Anarchist Black Cross and projects like that. Do you believe in this distinction between like political versus social prisoners, and how do you sort of understand that?
So I think there's actually always been this broader definition of political within social movements that do support for prisoners. People like George Jackson weren't in prison on political charges per se. Like they weren't in prison for crimes they committed for, their own understood political reasons, but they were people who got politicized in prison and aligned themselves with revolutionary social movements on the outside. And so that definition of political seems to have always been in use and I think leaves a lot of space for finding ways to support and feel affinity with people who get politicized in prison and, end up being part of our political communities after they've already gone to prison, versus people who, were a part of our political communities already and then ended up in jail for whatever reason. I think there will always be prisoners who need our support, and we always need to figure out a way to make the decision around who to support. And there's lots of different ways to make that decision. One is doing something like looking for political affinity and seeing if that's there. One is making that decision based on social position of prisoners, so trying to figure out who is like the most marginalized within the prison system and the most in need of support because of that. I don't know if we currently have the capacity on the outside to support everyone inside, so this does seem like a decision to, take seriously and think through in terms of who we do decide to support. People can make those decisions based on things like personal relationships or like geographic proximity, like all kinds of different things. But there's definitely, we have to figure out how to make that decision. And people have historically made that decision on the basis of like political versus social prisoner type reasoning. But yeah, I think the question is complicated enough that it's still worth thinking through. And I have seen more and more people in the last, 10 years or so using the phrase prison rebels as a way to describe people who get involved in organizing on the inside for better conditions, whether that looks like riots or strikes or, all kinds of things. I think people in the States have called for boycotts. Like I've seen that growing use more in the U.S. than in Canada necessarily. But yeah, I think it's complicated. I think it's worth thinking through. I think there's something to that distinction, but it's not as simple as it sometimes seems.
What kinds of anti-prison or prisoner solidarity projects are you excited about right now? I'm going to try and just name things in Canada because I think that's an interesting exercise to do. There's always lots of exciting stuff happening in the U.S., but I think people always know more about the stuff in the U.S. than the stuff here. So there's a few things. There's a couple interesting things happening in Ottawa right now. There's something called the Jail Accountability and Information Line, which is basically just a hotline where the number has been pretty widely publicized within all the jails in the Ottawa area, and they've received tons of calls and seem to have a bunch of volunteers on the other end of the phone. And they've been compiling information based on those phone calls and then sending them out into the world, which seems like a pretty cool project. There's also a fight against the expansion of a provincial jail there that's been happening that's getting organized around the phrase NOPE, which I think it stands for No on Prison Expansion, and that fight also seems pretty cool. There's the ongoing struggle against the building of a new prison for migrants outside of Montreal that's been pretty inspiring. There's a website called Stop à la Prison that has a lot of info that people can check out. There's the Black Power Hour radio show in Nova Scotia that has been doing really awesome stuff for years, and they were some of the people who, were in contact with people in Burnside when those folks went on strike at the same time as people in the U.S., in prison in the U.S., were going on strike. And it's been really cool to see people out in Halifax building those relationships and doing some awesome politicization work together too. I think their manifesto that they put out when that strike happened was very political and had a lot to say about Black August, which is another prison-related thing that people talk about in August, which is to celebrate commemorate the death of George Jackson, who got murdered in San Quentin on August 21st. But then Black August expands it to kind of Black revolutionary histories and remembering things like the Nat Turner Rebellion and the Watts Uprising and all kinds of events like that have happened historically in the month of August. But yeah, Black Power Hour is a radio show in Nova Scotia that's doing really cool stuff. And then, I'm always looking forward to the New Year's Eve noise demos in Montreal. I think watching anarchists continue with the New Year's Eve noise demo tradition is a pretty interesting way to start our own traditions and be trying to make connections with people inside and remind people inside that they're not forgotten on a pretty big deal holiday of the year. Which is kind of interesting to think about in the context of PJD and, what does it look like for us to be building revolutionary cultures together, and what kind of holidays would we want to do if it was up to us, and trying to do things like the New Year's Eve noise demos and Prisoner Justice Day and
recognizing those kinds of things together, I think, can be a way of building that kind of culture together, which certainly seems like it's an essential part of changing the world in the way that we want to change the world.
Totally. And what about people who are listening to this who are inspired to want to get involved with some kind of anti-prison or prisoner solidarity project, but maybe where they live, there's nothing going on yet and they don't know anyone personally? How do you sort of start?
There are a bunch of different pen pal programs across the U.S. and Canada. Specifically in Montreal, there's a group called the Prisoner Correspondence Project. And so if you're someone who like doesn't have any family inside, doesn't know anybody inside, maybe that's a good place to start, is like trying to get a pen pal and starting up a relationship with someone just so you have a sense of what's happening inside. But short of that, there's also tons of resources out there. There's certainly, CFRC has a prison radio show. There's lots of other prison radio shows across the country that also air voices and stories from people inside. There's projects like the Journal of Prisoners on Prisons, which I think is at jpp.org. And then there's the Penal Press Project, which I mentioned earlier, which is like a archive of newsletters that got written in prisons in Canada from like the 1940s till now, which is just this like massive archive that wouldn't exist if Bob Gaucher hadn't donated his whole collection to someone who started digitizing the whole thing. But certainly in terms of like education, those are good places to start. In terms of organizing, that's always trickier. I think like trying to find people to organize with where you are is like a huge question. And whether that looks like, trying to build relationships with your neighbors and see if your neighbors want to do anything with you versus like going to a community center and trying to build relationships that way, just trying to find a way to find other like-minded people and then, decide together if you want to start a letter writing night for prisoners. There's, the Anarchist Black Cross Network is across the U.S. and Canada, and they publish addresses and names for lots of different political prisoners and encourage people to organize letter writing nights. So there's lots of different ways to get involved. Finding people might be the hardest one, but that seems like it's maybe getting easier and easier these days. So.
And harder and harder at the same time somehow.
Yeah, totally.
Are there any texts or websites or books that you want to recommend?
So there's the zine that you mentioned, which is called Under New Management, Stories About Resistance to Prisons in Ontario and Quebec. That's available as a zine on It's Going Down's website, which is itsgoingdown.org. There's this book that I keep mentioning called Prisons in Canada by Luc Gosselin that, was put out in the 70s, but it's very good. There's all of Claire's books. I think there's Barred from Prison, Still Barred from Prison, and No Longer Barred from Prison. They're all books that Claire Culhane wrote that people should definitely check out if you want to get a good sense of prisoners' rights stuff in the 70s and 80s in Canada. You can check out EPIC, which ends the prison industrial complex, which used to exist in Kingston and has a website where they publish a lot of zines and used to publish a newsletter of writing from people on the inside. In terms of anarchist-specific stuff, Montreal Counterinfo and North Shore Counterinfo always have lots of stuff, like certainly in this latest round of repression in Hamilton and Cedar going back to jail, there were a lot of texts getting published on North Shore. People could check those out in terms of like anarchists ending up in prison. And then sites in the U.S. like It's Going Down or Anarchist News tend to have stuff about anarchists in the U.S. There's also lots of websites that publish more things about anarchists worldwide who end up in prison. I don't know how active sites like 325 are anymore, but you can certainly find things about like some of the anarchist prisoners in Greece or anarchist prisoners in different places in Europe or South America if you look around online, and statements by all of those people would be out online too. So people could go check all of that out. I think there's lots of different places to start.
I hate your jail cells, I hate your bars, I hate your chains, I hate these laws, women in the shadows, behind the shade. They don't see me, but every day I come 16 years older than you and girl, stolen from her home, from her reserve. First they take your language, then they take your land. Then you get beaten up by a strange white man. Then they put you in the shadow, behind the shade. Your jails, I hate your bars, I hate your chains, I hate these laws. Got my sister in the shadow, sisters behind the shade. They can't see me, they can't hear me. Every day I call. Cleve was from Africville land. They tore it down, didn't have nowhere to stand. Met a white man in the city, he called her down like a slave. Now that white man's lying 6 feet down in the grave. She's in the shadow, sister behind the shades. Okay, Mary. I hate your jails, Mary Watkins, I hate your bars. 2 million people in the United States. Look how far these shadows gone. Look at all the sisters in the shade. Can't they see? Can't you hear? Can't you hear? Can't you hear them call? Calling, calling, calling. Hear them call, hear them call. He called. Yeah, my sister's in the shadow, sister behind shade.
KiteLine is a weekly 30-minute radio program focusing on issues in the prison system. You'll hear news along with stories from prisoners and former prisoners as well as their loved ones. You'll learn what prison is, how it functions, and how it impacts all of us.
Behind the prison walls, a message is called a kite. Whispered words, a note passed hand to hand, a request submitted to the guards for medical care. Illicit or not, sending a kite means trusting that other people will bear it farther along until it reaches its destination. Here on KiteLine, we hope to share these words across the prison walls.
You can hear us on the Channel Zero network and find out more at kitelineradio.noblogs.org.
How can we imagine a world beyond prisons and police, borders and surveillance? Rust Belt Abolition Radio is an abolitionist media and movement building project based in Detroit, Michigan.
Each monthly episode amplifies the voices of those impacted by mass incarceration and explores ongoing work in the movement to abolish the carceral state and racial capitalism.
Tune in to Rust Belt Abolition Radio here on the Channel Zero Network and visit www.rustbeltradio.org to learn more.